Hello, my name is Benji and welcome to Dice vs Cards. Today we go back to Arkham Horror, the card game. Last time round we did a series focusing on the Guardian class, but today we go from blue to yellow and bring you a series focusing on those intellectuals, the Seekers. And what better way to start than with a class toolkit, detailing what cards you should strongly consider bringing with your Seeker wherever you go. We'll try and have you covered with all the different slot choices and maybe some leftovers too. As I'm sure you're already aware at this point, Seekers are the masters of clue gathering, oft having the requisite high intellect at their disposal, but not necessarily always, and this is to say that they generally favour assets of the non-weapon variety. As such, let's take a look at some of those staple cards that our yellow bordered investigators like to take along with them. So harkening back to the core set, the good old vanilla magnifying glass is pretty much every Seeker's best friend. So long as this gets you to that +2 to your skill test marker, then this is gold dust. Just bear in mind that anything more might be a little bit overkill on standard difficulty. Then we have what I'll call your quest assets, starting off as relative chaff but giving you an upgrade path to something super sexy. With Archaic glyphs, you'll be hoping to draw this early to see some return on investment with the resources. And once you translate the text, you'll have a choice of 3 specializations to choose from: Guiding Stones, Prophecy Foretold and Markings of Isis. Now it's the Guiding Stones that make most sense in a Seeker deck. You need a typical Seeker with a natively high intellect to make this pop, but on standard difficulty it's relatively easy to get those additional clues. Just consider that this won't scale well with higher difficulties, and it'll be slightly less consistent the less players there are due to the number of clues available. Prophecy Foretold can absolutely do a job, but more if you're going solo, as this allows you to ignore enemies and still do your thing. And Markings of Isis is just a bust. Far too unpredictable to invest this much effort into getting. And also note that this switches from a hand slot to an arcane slot in the transition, so may well be a deal breaker depending on what off-class cards you've got to choose from. Next up is the slightly harder, and when I say harder I mean it takes slightly longer to get, Ancient Stone. The reason for that is that the original quest card itself costs an XP, and when you upgrade the all-in cost is 5 experience points. So for those reasons it needs to give you a better card than the Archaic glyphs did. Your choices for upgrades are Knowledge of the Elders, Minds in Harmony and Transient Thoughts. Well, as you can see, it turns out you couldn't cheese the quest condition because you get more uses from what comes out the other side the higher the initial skill test was. Knowledge of the Elders seems like a great card, and it's not bad by any means, especially if you need to be self-sufficient, but it needs a partner card, like Critic Research for example, to deal with anything meaningful, and so for the effort you need to get there it's just not worth it. It's a similar story with Transient Thoughts. Free moves are great, even though it doesn't make you immune from attacks of opportunity, but again it's too much work to get to this card. Minds in Harmony though is the obvious choice. Healing Horror is not particularly easy to access for Seekers, and Healing Horror at a time whenever you draw a card is much more the sort of return you want from something like this. But there is one more quest to talk about as we transition to assets of the non-slot variety, that being Strange Solution. This time we have a net cost of 4 XP, so somewhere in between the previous two, and this time we have 4 choices: Restorative Concoction, Acidic Ichor, Freezing Variant and Empowering Elixir. The first gives us good value for our supplies, healing is good. Paying 4 XP and a deck slot, less so. The second, Acidic Ichor, is really where it's at with these choices. One absolutely banging ability. Yes, it's only got 3 uses, which is the very least you'd expect from this sort of card, but it's one uber powerful one, so we forgive it. Freezing Variant makes me ask, why? when this other card we've just talked about lets me permanently deal with things. An empowering elixir makes for a great support card, but it falls a little bit shy of being high on a list of priorities. Right, I promise we're done with quest cards now. So next up are higher education, pathfinder and fieldwork. Now the former has had an interesting design history. The level 0 version is a decent enough card, and most of these dual skill pump cards cost a couple of bucks, and so the offset of 5 or more cards in your hand was a fairly well balanced trade off. The problem is they went and printed a 3 XP cost of this card that is absolutely busted. For those 3 experience points, I'm getting this in play at all times, and I get a 2-for-1 bump for every buck. Holy buckwheat, yes. I have actually no idea why this card was printed. It promotes card hoarding, which probably shouldn't be a thing. And yes, to be fair, they recognise this somewhat with the taboo amendments, bumping the cost up to a whopping 8 XP, but this is probably still too cheap for what it does. Arguably a must-have in higher difficulties, but less impactful on standard and with a 5 intellect seeker. Pathfinder, on the other hand, might not be busted, but for 1 XP, a card that gives you a pseudo extra action a turn is hella useful. Free movement should not be sniffed at, no matter the scenario, and definitely consider this high on your priorities for upgrades. Fieldwork is also a card that brings real value to the table. Acting like a renewable source of perception isn't the worst thing you can say about a card. This has a similar set of scaling ideals to higher education in that it does well at higher difficulties and will benefit lower intellect seekers. Moving to your ally slots, it's fairly simple. You've got Dr. Christopher Milan and then just a handful of maybes. So Dr. Milan, bless him. Another card so good that it got tabooed, and provided an almost endless supply of glorious resources. A +1 to your intellect, all for the cost and 4 measly dollars. Need I say more? The taboo effect made the resource gain a once per turn affair, which is probably just about spot on. So with the also rans are all varying degrees of situational. Dr. Ross Esquire gets better than more people round the table. This can in that instance be a perfectly synergistic card. Dr. William T. Mullison's greatest asset is that he's a 2/2 soak for 1 resource. His signature ability is far too luck dependent to be worth your while, and quite often cards that stop the bad things happening scale well in harder difficulty levels, but Arkham Horror doesn't really work that way, so the odds are you'll replace oh bollocks with oh crap. Finally, Mr. Rook, I actually have a lot of time for. Searching that many cards, you're bound to find something you need, and clearly he'll work very well with builds that are highly reliant on certain cards. But it's the weakness draw that should concern me but doesn't. Who doesn't hate drawing a weakness at the end of a turn? Well, this lets you somewhat add an air of predictability to this painful process. And if you've been watching my previous investigator guides, you'll recall the recurring theme of this weakness really sucks balls if you draw it late. Well, why not force it early? I really do think we've spent enough time talking about assets, so it's time for event cards. I've got a plan, anatomical diagrams, and mind over matter are some good ways to be dealing with the big nasties. The first one is one of the few reliable to one-shot a big guy on the other end of your book, and the latter two are very similar in terms of what they do. Just remember, without access to much, if any, plus damage, you'll be using these guys to evade more often than not. Shortcut and working a hunch are your vanilla freebies. With the former, didn't we already agree that action cheating movement is a good thing? And with the latter, although this is a better level 0 off-class card, it's still more or less good enough to warrant inclusion in a number of Seeker builds. Which brings us neatly to the very end of this carousel with some skill card choices. Deduction and Eureka I really like. An Inquiring Mind is just a tier below it and doesn't compare quite well enough, at least for a Seeker, to the neutral options you have. Just bear in mind with deduction that it's less impactful with less clues at lower player counts. And Eureka has a great payoff, but having multiple skill icons dilutes its consistency. Before we wrap up, I'm going to try and nip the what about such and such flame war by mentioning cards that just didn't flow with the sequence of the video. I like these fine, they just didn't stand out or need further explanation. Cryptic Research gives you fantastic fast speed card economy for 4 XP, and Crack the Case is a card for a Seeker that's easily up there with Emergency Cache, predominantly because of its action economy. And Hawkeye Folding Camera is a great card early game, a good card mid game, and a meh card late game. So there you have it, a semi-exhaustive look at all the cards you might want to consider when building your Seeker deck. Obviously each investigator will lend itself and complement different cards accordingly, so you might also want to check out previous videos to consider what off-class and neutral cards to take. But for now, I hope you found this helpful, and I'll see you next time.